cloud in the chamber, we can then do various things to it to see whether or not we can convert this supercooled cloud to snow. This cloud is made up of liquid water droplets. They are not snow crystals as yet, but by taking a tiny piece of dry ice such as this and scratching it so a few tiny fragments fall into the supercooled cloud, long streaks develop just like the vapor trail from an airplane. These contain millions and millions of tiny submicroscopic snow crystals which grow very fast and assume exactly the same forms that natural snowflakes show in an ordinary snowstorm. This is a picture of the first cloud that we seeded back last November. Flying in a small Fairchild plane and putting dry ice from a small dispenser in the bottom of the plane, we put about 6 pounds of dry ice into this 4-mile cloud, and within a very few minutes saw long streamers of snow falling from the base of the cloud and evaporating into the drier air below. Under many conditions, of course, full-fledged snowstorms will be produced in this way.
Vincent Schaefer wasn't the only man who conducted cloud seeding experiments. Two other gentlemen were along his side, Bernard Vonnegut and Irving Lingmuir. Although cloud seeding seemed like an excellent creation to prevent droughts or wildfires, Lingmuir later stated, and I quote, "In the amount of energy liberated, the effect of 30 milligrams of silver iodide under optimum conditions equals that of one atomic bomb." As years went by, more men and women began to utilize the use of cloud seeding. Many were led to the idea of controlling hurricanes, wildfires, storms, and projects like Project Cirrus, Project Scud, Project Skyfire, Project Skywater, and many others. Much of these projects were conducted all over the United States of America. As a result to all of this, a video recorded around 1965, which originates from a TV show called Science and Engineering Television Journal, came forth with a couple of scientists to disclose how cloud seeding can be used to manipulate or control hurricanes and storms.
One of the most exciting developments in science today concerns the possibility that it may one day be possible to modify and perhaps even control weather and climate.
Walt Disney also created a film in 1959 called Eyes to Outer Space, where scientists go over how satellites and other technologies could be used to control the Earth's natural weather in the near future.
These future satellites will be the key to precise forecasting and control of weather.
The federal government, with the CIA, with the US Navy and Air Force, later took over weather modification programs for their own intentions. This was the beginning of Project Storm Fury and National Modification Cumulus Project. The purpose of these projects was to see if it was possible to either dissipate a hurricane by the use of cloud seeding or increase rainfall and storms. After several experiments with cloud seeding, they figured out that weather control alone could serve as a weapon for war and that steering storms could be used for destroying land resources. This is true because during 1969 and 1970, the CIA was reported of ruining Cuba's sugar crops by the use of cloud seeding. This was originally disclosed by a gentleman named Lowell Pont. Lowell Pont claimed that the CIA's goal was to destabilize the weather in the Soviet Union and China to ruin harvests in order to create political unrest. Before these allegations, however, was Operation Popeye in 1967. Operation Popeye was sponsored by Henry Kissinger and CIA to seed clouds during the Vietnam War, causing landslides and an overdose of rainfall. This perhaps was the inception of weather warfare, which is simply the definition of the military interfering with or using weather modification for their own purposes, which of course could be for good or evil. Due to these violent uses of weather modification from the military and government, The Environmental Modification Convention later signed an international treaty in 1977 to ban weather warfare completely, prohibiting the military from using weather modification for hostile purposes. Nevertheless, Russians still had this technology in use, according to a report in 1979. NOAA also conducted an atmospheric modification program in 1980. Surprisingly, a Navy physicist and weather modification expert, Dr. Ben Livingston, actually briefed President Lyndon B. Johnson on the effectiveness of weather control back in the 1960s. Ben Livingston was involved in cloud seeding programs, such as Project Storm Fury and Operation Popeye. In an interview with Alex Jones, Ben Livingston exposes how the U.S. government has always wanted to have pure control of hurricanes. He also goes on to explain that Hurricane Katrina could have actually been greatly minimized by the use of cloud seeding, but was allowed to fully impact the Gulf states for political reasons. Sounds like treason to me, wink wink.
The results from the Hurricane Debbie experiment seemed so positive that many individuals believed the project should go operational, seeding major hurricanes that threaten land. A team of scientists at Stanford Research Institute at Stanford University did a decision analysis on all past seeding events, including the Esther, that's the 1961 and 1963 experiments. Dr. James Masterson of that group, reflecting their views, stated, "We claim they should consider seeding now if a big hurricane comes straight from Miami." These scientists said the government may have to accept responsibility for not seeding and thereby exposing the public to higher probabilities of severe storm damage and possible higher death tolls.
You can find the full interview in YouTube just by typing "the father of weaponized weather" in the search bar. You can also find it on a website called casecorner.wordpress.com. Even though the US had officially banned weather warfare, weather modification was still a plausible solution to have a positive impact against storms, droughts, tornadoes, etc. In a National Weather Modification Policy Act in 1976 published by Congress, it states, "Weather modification technology has significant potential for preventing, diverting, or moderating the adverse effects of such disasters and hazards." This policy act helped escalate many more weather modification programs, which involved things like marine cloud brightening boats and new strategies to control the ionosphere, which led to the birth of HAARP. We'll be covering HAARP later on as we continue to unfold who's behind weather control in today's era. Now that we understand where the concept of weather modification comes from and how it all began, we must now figure out what geoengineering is and how chemtrails fit in the category of weather modification. But before we continue, I want to give a shout out to a guy named Jim Lee for providing this information on weather modification. His work is phenomenal. Most of the information that I have gathered for this video comes from his website, weathermodificationhistory.com and climateviewer.com. You can find all the historic information, policy acts, technologies, and more about weather modification in his websites. Anyways, we will now be focusing our attention to the modern era of weather modification and expose it for what it is, and show you how weather warfare is now at full scale around us 24/7, and how our corrupted state of secret men have taken over weather modification programs, and show you their agenda for the use of such technologies. Now that we understand the origins and the history and the lore of weather modification, we can now start to unfold the current weather modification programs that are currently occurring and happening right in front of our eyes every day, 24/7 in the skies. So, we're going to be discussing about geoengineering, specifically solar geoengineering, also known as stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. And I want to begin with David Keefe and Harvard University, because during 2015, David Keefe and Harvard University came out in public specifically talking about and disclosing what solar geoengineering is, which is briefly summarized in their own website, stating, and I quote, "Geoengineering refers to a set of emerging technologies that could manipulate the environment and partially offset some of the impacts of climate change. Certain technologies are actually being proposed by geoengineer scientists as a potential advancement for geoengineering. One of the technologies to be used for geoengineering is cloud seeding. In a smart chart, it briefly explains how cloud seeding works. And I will quote, "Silver iodide is released by a plane or ground-based generator. Silver iodide particles reach the targeted cloud. The silver iodide aids in the formation of ice crystals. The ice crystals become large enough to create snow." Another form of technology to be used for geoengineering is ocean iron fertilization, or aquatrails. It's basically the idea of dumping iron into the oceans, which would grow phytoplankton, which would capture CO2. Another form of technology to be used for geoengineering is marine cloud brightening boats. The strategy would be to spray salt water into the air to make marine clouds reflect more incoming solar radiation. As seen in this photo, they already have tested it out. A fourth proposal by geoengineers are space mirrors, which are self-explanatory. And finally, the one we have been waiting for, stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, which is described by a geoengineer named Alan Robock as, and I quote, "One suggested geoengineering response involves creating a cloud of particles in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight." According to Dr. Gernot Wignier, a co-director of Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program, he claims that a hypothetical deployment program starting 15 years from now would be technically possible, strictly from an engineering perspective. And according to Wake Smith, a study co-author at Yale, stated that no aircraft has the combination of altitude and payload capabilities required for stratospheric aerosol injection. In other words, geoengineering scientists claim they don't have the technology to do such a thing. And if they did, they would say they wouldn't know the outcomes or the consequences of using these geoengineering schemes via these technologies they propose to use.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is the one I was referring to a moment ago. We don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means there's always a danger, if you try to engineer the system on a large scale, that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure with the geoengineering in the first place. There are a variety of schemes that have been discussed for geoengineering. A classic example is injecting reflecting particles into Earth orbit that would deflect some of the sunlight that would otherwise be warming the Earth, and in that way try to produce a cooling effect to offset the heating effect of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
In addition, in an episode of the Colbert Report from Stephen Colbert, he interviews David Keefe specifically on solar geoengineering. What you're about to hear is perhaps one of the most vital information out there to this day, at least in my opinion, on geoengineering, coming from the man who is actually participating in this geoengineering program. Take a listen.
you could actually spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up in a ugly tech fix.
You can spray something into the atmosphere to change.
Spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
How do you do this?
You start with a fleet of modified business jets and say 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year, and each year you have to put a little more, and this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in.
No, we'll get to it eventually. But in the meantime, we're shrouding the Earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid.
We put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, but it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that.
1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
What happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down, but it's a tiny addition to what we're already doing.
Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the end?
It actually turns out to be an old idea. This was known since President Johnson.
You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
Seems extremely unlikely.
That the United States is not telling something to its citizens? That seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already.
So there you have it. They came out publicly talking about solar geoengineering, and nobody seemed to care. And still to this very day, there's posts everywhere, news articles of them saying, well, we might, experiment with geoengineering, or yes, we are experimenting, but you never know the consequences, etc., etc., etc. Even though we see a similar aspect of what they call stratospheric aerosol injection happening in our skies almost on a daily basis, all you gotta do is peek at your window, look at the sky, and you'll begin to start noticing jets, whether it be commercial or military aircraft, spraying long-lasting lines that stretch from horizon to horizon that linger into a hazy, milky, gray-looking sky and clouds. Nevertheless, these same stratospheric aerosol injections are actually chemtrails. If you don't know what chemtrails are, I would recommend reading a book from a guy named William Thomas, an author of his book Chemtrails Confirm. In his book, he describes the differences of a chemtrail and a contrail, laying down all the facts of whether or not what we're seeing in the skies are actual chemical trails or condensation trails, with actual data from NASA and NOAA themselves. Surprisingly, William Thomas was actually the first man to popularize and promote the word chemtrails.
A chemical trail leaves a plume that stays in the sky for many hours, and chemtrails are rarely seen alone. What we most commonly see are X patterns, parallel rows, tic-tac-toe like grids in the sky, and of course airliners do not fly those kind of traffic patterns, particularly over rural areas where they're rarely seen. So chemical trails last a long time, and another giveaway is that if the sun is behind them, we often see a prismatic or rainbow effect in the sky through those chemical trails, indicating, scientists have told me, indicating the presence of chemicals in the air.
Stratospheric well-back seeding for reduction of global warming. A process to reflect infrared energy back into space. And this patent called for chemicals to be sprayed into the greenhouse gas layer, wait for this, 22,000 feet and higher. What were they going to spray? Oxides of metal. Which oxide? Aluminum oxide. Now you're saying, well, that's a heck of a lot of airplanes flying a lot of missions to spray that kind of material. So we turned to the United States Air Force, and you know what I found? They happen to own over 800 tanker aircraft, KC-135 and KC-10 aircraft. Exactly the planes that we have positively identified in hundreds of photographs and miles of videotape as the aircraft spraying these chemtrails.
You mentioned earlier that you're a pilot.
Yeah.
Talk about chemtrails. We hear a lot about that. What are those, and are they for real?
Well, when you look into that and ask questions, they say, oh yeah, contrails. No. Contrails are behind a jet. If you see a jet flying very high, the stripe, the condensed stripe behind it, that's normal. But in areas first observed where there's very little population, you see a jet airplane going, and it's not only one, they have 4 condensed stripes behind them. They go this way, this way, this way, this way, and then this way, this way, this way, this way. And when you inquire about it, ask people, you recognize that the real climate change scientists are truly ticked off, because apparently nobody really is asking them. It's the special interest, in my opinion, it's the oil industry, the energy industry, that are blowing smoke up somebody's you-know-what, and telling them that we have to lay a pattern up there to prevent sun energy from hitting Earth. And what they're doing in there, it's now pretty much determined. They're putting in there aluminum, barium, and strontium. Now you take these chemicals and run them through a PubMed literature search in respect to human health, you will find more than 3,000 papers. Aluminum alone, aluminum Alzheimer's, right, mental, there's no question about it. Now it so happens, when there were people who really paid attention, if there was due to some weather and air changes, wind patterns, suddenly this stuff that they're laying out there, it comes down in rain. If it falls on crops, it kills the crops. It's like they have big blisters on any one of the crops, vegetables or things like this. Organic crops, totally destroyed, can't even use them.
All 3 of these elements, if ingested enough by the body, could lead to health problems. For example, ingestion of too much aluminum may potentially cause Alzheimer's, as well as respiratory failure. Barium can have similar effects, like making you nausea or have a severe impact to your heart. And I can go on. The bottom line is that all 3 chemicals have some sort of major impact to our health if we ingest high levels of it, of course. And the thing is, every day, at least most of the time, they're spraying these things everywhere in the sky, exponentially, almost non-stop. And I think the point that I'm trying to get across is that how can we avoid all this ingestion of aluminum, barium, strontium from the sky, from these chemtrails, if they're spraying almost every day? And the thing is, all this lands on trees, the food, the oceans, the waters, the lakes, the plants, everywhere, even the insects.
About 1/3 of the American food supply depends on bees. They help pollinate many crops, but the bee population is declining. This nature preserve in Chester County is trying to reverse that with a pollination garden to attract bees. But they'll face a new challenge as the U.S. Department of Agriculture suspends collecting data for its annual honeybee colonies report, an important tool for understanding the plummeting honeybee population.
What you would see is more desert than you would see healthy, vibrant landscapes. Their critical impact is on the food source.
Scientists say bee populations have been steadily declining for more than a decade because of parasites, pesticides, habitat loss, and climate change.
You know, it's pretty funny that mainstream scientists and media always tend to blame global warming or climate change for every disease or natural disaster out there that occurs on a daily basis. Yet they avoid anything else but CO2. For example, there's something called cirrus clouds. Cirrus clouds are induced by supposed persistent long contrails. These cirrus clouds trap heat, and in these cirrus clouds are soot and carbon black dust. In soot, there's aluminum, barium, and a whole bunch of elements in them that fall out and create these looking cirrus clouds.
Soot is filled with metals such as chromium, iron, molybdenum, sodium, calcium, aluminum, vanadium, barium, cobalt, copper, nickel, lead, magnesium, manganese, silicon, titanium, and zirconium. Considering that some fraction of soot can effectively act as an ice nucleating particle, and that a dominant fraction of ice residuals in cirrus clouds contain metal compounds, the presented findings support the assumption that aircraft engine emissions can act as ice nucleating particles, or cloud condensation nuclei, or just generically called a cloud seed.
If you're still in doubt that these trails in the skies aren't containing chemicals or particulates, I would recommend looking at the samples that I will present right now. Some of these samples contain high amounts of aluminum, barium, or even strontium, or even other elements just higher than their normal rate of level.
It is called geoengineering, fighting global warming by putting a chemical dust in the atmosphere and reflecting harmful radiation back into space.
You could use barium oxide, for example, which makes big fluffy clouds. You could use tiny little bits of aluminum, which is benign in the environment, and essentially manage the climate.
And what I found was unusual spiking since the early 1990s in barium, aluminum.
But Rosalind Peterson of California Skywatch says health department records show a sharp increase in both chemicals in the water supply of Northern California, dating from the time the huge contrails first appeared over her home in Mendocino County.
What's the significance of the barium and the aluminum?
I went and got all the tests, and all these things in the same test would be up way over state and federal standards. It had to be airborne, because how could it get to such diverse regions of our county? We have jets going in every direction. X's, east, west, north, south, circles. There is something going on in the air. I don't know exactly what, but I think there's some experimentation.
I would also recommend listening to David Keefe's presentations, as he himself and many of his other geoengineer lobbyists have explored the possibility of using aluminum and other elements for geoengineering.
I'll tell you a little bit about some new work we've been doing, thinking about how you actually might put aerosols in the stratosphere. The novel method we've been thinking about, or it's not novel at all, it's actually exactly what happens from aircraft contrails, is that we put a condensable, a few megatons a year of sulfur would be enough to produce sort of 4 watts per square meter radial forcing directly out of the back of an aircraft. There's a huge literature in the nanofabrication world about making fine particles from low vapor pressure gas, and there's nothing very hard in terms of aircraft engineering. If you go to aircraft engineers, and we've done this, they say that would be easy, we could do this if you want us to. We've mostly thought about sulfur, and there's a lot of good reasons to think about sulfur, because sulfur's what nature does, at least in this version of the model, is if you put sulfur in continuously, you actually get a remarkably ineffective result. Nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about aluminum. The big deal really is that aluminum has 4 times the volumetric rate as sulfur, but roughly 16 times less the coagulation rate. So you could get away, we think, with much smaller mass flux. The little picture is from a nanofabrication study, which shows you can make high-quality aluminum particles just by spraying aluminum vapor out, which oxidizes. So it certainly seems pretty cost-effective and easy to do this with aircraft that are not very different from conventional aircraft. High-class business jets like the Gulfstream have wing designs that are very efficient. So with slightly different engine choices, they can easily deliver large weights up to sort of 20 kilometers or a little higher. And you could do that by either building new versions of these aircraft or even re-engineering existing aircraft. We have engineering firms that can do it. So you go to an engineering firm and you want this done. They don't say this is hard or unusual. They say, okay, yes, we could do it.
I don't know if this is true or not, that some scientists are trying to figure out a way to block the sun to try to slow down global warming?
Yeah, it's a measure of the feeling of desperation that some of them feel.
Are they really thinking they could do that?
Well, some of them are seriously proposing, and I think it's completely nuts.
Yeah.
You put another kind of pollution, sulfur dioxide, up to orbit, cover the atmosphere. The sky won't be really blue in the way it is now anymore, but it would block out some of the sun's heat so that we wouldn't have to take the difficult steps to stop spewing all this global warming pollution into the atmosphere. And of course, there are a lot of problems with what they're proposing.
As for anyone who doubts that a global chemtrail program is occurring, I would encourage you to take a step back. Let's first go over the first excuse, the World War II bombers.
Countless disinformation sources are doing their best to try and cast doubt in the public's mind about the blatantly obvious climate engineering assault going on in skies around the globe. They tell us climate engineering is not happening. And what do they offer as proof for such a conclusion? They often refer to photos or film footage of World War II B-17 bombers leaving massive trails behind them during bombing runs, as if this somehow proves we should see the same massive trails behind modern, high-bypass, turbofan jet engines that are standard equipment on all military tankers and all commercial carriers. What the official sources of disinformation don't tell us about the World War II piston engine bombers is that they were actually equipped with water vapor injection systems for their primitive piston-driven engines. These engines also put out immense amounts of pollution and particulate matter, which further facilitated the potential for forming visible trails. The World War II bomber film footage you are looking at clearly shows a starting and stopping sequence of the trail emitting from the aircraft. What does this mean? It means that what we're seeing is not simply a result of typical exhaust condensation, as we've been told. U.S. patents for climate engineering processes go back at least to 1920, and historical documents prove the U.S. military was openly engaged in climate modification experimentation and deployment by the mid-1940s. So what type of trail exactly are we seeing behind the B-17s that's being turned on and off? Is it the water vapor injection systems? Is it related to early weather modification experiments? We can speculate, but this is certain. A condensation trail doesn't start and stop midair as if it was cut with a knife. There are no such atmospheric conditions that would create such an abrupt cessation of a naturally occurring exhaust vapor trail. The official denial of the ongoing global climate engineering assault is far beyond criminal. The public's propensity to blindly accept the official denial of what they can easily see and clearly see with their own eyes is beyond perplexing and troubling. The upper level canopy of jet aircraft sprayed solar radiation management particulate trails is blatantly obvious to anyone who's willing to utilize their sense of vision and their sense of reason.
While people like Dane Wigington are exposing the dangers of this global geoengineering program, mainstream media continues to discredit all viable sources with their term conspiracy theory and leaving Wikipedia links to their point of view of this whole chemtrail aerosol spraying, leading the masses into the conception of condensation trails, which I don't deny, but what we're seeing globally, the spraying, the haze, the weird cloud patterns, are certainly not water vapor.
By the USPTO.gov is from the government, is providing this information. It is public. So here is the USPTO, United States Patent and Trademark Office. If you look to the right, these are the patents. If you look to the left, these are the dates that they happened and what they're doing. 1920 is when it started to happen. The process and apparatus for the production of intense artificial clouds, fog, or mist. And they go on. I'm going to go slowly. I'm not going to read this for you because you can take a look for yourself.
The question now remains, is there anything else that's being sprayed from these chemtrail aerosols? The answer is absolutely yes. Substances like nanoparticles, carbon black, and lithium have also been reported to be sprayed by these jet aircrafts according to the samples that William Thomas collected and from the research that I've conducted. The thing is, these substances don't need to just come from aircraft, but can also come from satellites from space or sounding rockets, according to NASA.
The people of Espanola raised such a ruckus that the Ministry of Environment Ontario was forced to get involved. And they ran tests on rainwater following the heavy spray days. And guess what they found? They found carbon black, which the United States Air Force says they use for weather modification. They found hundreds of molds, fungi, but most of what they found was aluminum. 7 times the safe levels. Aluminum at levels the North Lab said would kill fish. We have the lab test, we have the study. It matches the Hughes patent. It matches what Edward Teller and Freeman Dyson and others were calling for.
Yeah, it's very important we communicate what we're doing to the public. We're very interested in making sure everyone knows what we're doing. We're not, we're a civilian space agency dedicated to science and research and so on. So we're very, very keen to make sure that the taxpayers know what we're doing and everything. So.
Well, you know, when the article came out in the major newspapers, including the Huffington Post, there was no mention of lithium. Not one. Not one mention of lithium. Until I heard the recording of the actual, I listened to it. I listened to the rockets go off. I had no idea there was going to be a lithium dispersed until I heard payload lithium dispersed.
Good indicators of chemical deploys. And lithium on Ontario Improved Divine have been deployed. Okay.
RSO TDOSS requests to declare the area clear and release the roadblocks.
TD concurs if RSO does.
RSO concurs.
Oh, it copies. Yeah, the science team reports out that they do see the lithium trails. These lithium trails allow them to look at the winds and that of the ionosphere, and these winds are believed to be the carriers of the dynamic.
Well, make sure everyone knows that we see the lithium from the airplane.
Roger that.
What you just heard was an excerpt of a telephone call that Madison Star Moon made to NASA, asking NASA about the chemtrails and lithium being sprayed. They admit that they are spraying lithium, and lithium appears at night red, pink colors in our sky. What I want to ask all of you is the video that you will see of mine in a few minutes. Do you see this color in your skies? Because I see it often here, and I absolutely do believe that they are spraying lithium quite often into our atmosphere. And this is a very, very dangerous soft metal that they are spraying. But here on NASA, on their own site, microdust weaponry, a mechanical analog to micron-sized mechanized dust, which is distributed as an aerosol and inhaled into the lungs. Dust mechanically bores into lung tissue and executes various pathological missions, a wholly new class of weaponry which is legal.
What you just watched was NASA admitting spraying lithium with sounding rockets and by chemtrail aerosols, as I like to call it. And they also have a document of exotic weapons. The future, called The Future Is Now. In this document, they say that they would spray smart dust by aerosols. What is smart dust? Smart dust is basically small little rice looking chips made out of nanotechnology that can be dispersed either by aircraft, aerosols, or injected into the body, which by default can damage the body from inside, causing a disease known as Morgellons syndrome. And as you can see here by these photos, these are the results of the growth of these nanofibers that expand and grow inside your body and eventually come out.
Everything you've learned, please, can't you just give me the medicine, please? I'm gonna die if you don't. I can't.
A call from Leanne Cofield's sister.
I'm in constant pain.
A brief message with a long story. Leanne believes something is killing her mother and both of her sisters. Painful sores cover parts of their bodies, and no one seems to be able or willing to help. Leanne moved from Mobile to Sheffield, Alabama last year to be closer to her family.
This is my mother, Rebecca.
But being close is no longer an option.
I haven't touched my mother since August.
She believes touching is just too risky.
They hurt.
Rebecca Cofield started developing these sores in August of 2005.
They don't necessarily itch, but they do hurt. And just the emotional and the physical part of it, you know, is just makes me not be able to do very much of anything. The sores on my head and my hair falling out. And
her daughters, Beth and Crystal, also began to develop the sores.
It feels like stabbing pain, stinging. And after having never had any health problems before, I've been treated like I'm a hypochondriac, like I've delusional.
They've been to doctor after doctor seeking help. Instead of getting it, they've been called crazy.
They would like to put us in a mental health center.
Leanne turned to the internet hoping to find help for her family.
And that's where I found that message board of the Morgellons, and it seemed to fit.
She found countless others experiencing the same misery, a brain fog of sorts, problems concentrating, the feeling of bugs crawling on and biting the skin, and painful itchy sores that produce mysterious red and blue fibers and black specks. Some have even reported finding parasites in their sores.
And other things you find, now it's getting fringe, it's really getting fringe, is fragments of insect skin being extracted from a Morgellon victim. So something makes these, something from this disease is making insect parts or insects grow within the human body.
Cloud seeding continues to be practiced in over 34 countries worldwide. But silver iodide and dry ice nuclei are Stone Age technologies compared to today's higher tech particle payloads. The most amazing of these belong to a family of weather mod devices that are so small you might not see one, even if it was floating in your eye. Ranging from the ultra-tiny to the nearly invisible, these are the revolutionary micro-machines that will be the workhorses of any world weather control system. They're MEMS, micro-electromechanical sensors.
GEMS are global environmental MEMS sensors, a concept that we have come up with that deals with a massive wireless network of airborne probes.
The idea is to release 10,000 or more of these dust-sized probes every day from airplanes, stratospheric platforms, or satellites. Like weather balloons, the probes would monitor weather information over every kilometer of the Earth's surface at a resolution that is today unheard of. It's also possible that the GEMS themselves could be made to play an active role in cloud dynamics. In effect, cloud seeding with 1 million microscopic computers.
We could potentially use these very small devices either as cloud condensation nuclei to seed clouds the way that current weather modification is done, or potentially something even more futuristic would be to actually have the devices be active, where they could introduce some perturbation into parts of the atmosphere to actually modify the weather.
In conclusion, we have geoengineering lobbyists claiming that they're supposedly going to start spraying the skies and the stratosphere in the near future to combat global warming, even though we all know that's a cover-up for the current chemtrail program that is happening right before our eyes. We also know they're spraying in these chemtrails are aluminum, barium, strontium, carbon black dust, soot, lithium, nanoparticulates. We also know these elements are being used for weather modification programs and are falling down, harming the human population and insects. And finally, we know the three key players behind the chemtrail aerosol spraying. Number 1, NASA, or in its entirety, the US government allied with the military-industrial congressional complex and Air Force. Number 2, geoengineering lobbyists who are being funded by a high-level elite named Bill Gates, who has connections to the Bilderberg Group and the Rockefeller Foundation, which we'll get into later and why that's important, as well as NOAA. And number 3, your local weather modification companies who are using cloud seeding to modify the weather, whether it be for good or bad intentions. Now that we know who's behind the chemtrail aerosol spraying and what's coming down from the spraying, we can now start to see and finally find out how this chemtrail aerosol spraying is working in conjunction with HAARP, High Frequency Active Aurora Research Program. We will now be finding and looking at HAARP and see the correlations between HAARP and the chemtrail aerosol spraying and how the military and our own government is using it for weather warfare and weather modification.